Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a flip through of my reading journal because in a previous video, maybe 2 videos ago, I asked if you'd be interested in seeing this and a few people in the comments said yes. So here I am, giving the people what they want. I'll first talk a bit about just like my general reading journaling system, style, whatever you want to call it, and then I'll do a flip through of most of the pages. I'm going to do my kind of backfilled pages from January to August, which is where I wrote about my favourite books of the year so far. I only actually started this journal in September, and then, to be honest, I didn't really read anything in September or October. So yeah, I'll show the January to August pages because they actually have some substance. September to October is basically empty, and I have started reading again this month in November. I've finally broken the slump, but more about that later because I'll probably mention the book I'm reading at some point. Anyway, before I get started, a few disclaimers specific to like book content. One is I just want to say that everything I say in this video about the books that I've read is my opinion, just my opinion. It's not intended to be me telling people what they should or shouldn't read. It is completely fine to disagree with my opinion. If I say that I didn't like a book so much, that does not mean that you shouldn't read it. If I say I did like a book, that doesn't mean you should read it. It doesn't mean that you should enjoy it if you do read it. I think that what you read and what you enjoy is so subjective. Like, I could say that I adore a book, and another person might very validly say that it wasn't for them for XYZ reason. Like, there's truly very, very, very rarely no right or wrong answer or review of a book. It's so subjective. So yeah, please don't take this as me saying, like, if you don't like this book, then you're a rubbish reader. Like, no, I'm not saying that. People can read whatever they want, in my opinion, and enjoy it. Another thing to note is that most of the books, in fact, I think all but one of the books in here is fiction. I don't tend to read much non-fiction, not because I don't enjoy it, but because my day job involves reading a lot of non-fiction writing. And by the time I finish that, I don't really want to read it for fun. You know what I mean? So yeah, mostly fiction, with the exception of like literally this one book here that is non-fiction. Final thing to note is, as you'll see on this page, I use a star rating system. The 5-star rating for me means that it's like outstanding, best of the best, one of my favorite books, like truly wonderful. 4 stars are for books that are like very good. Maybe they have like a couple of things that I didn't vibe with, but like nothing major. I still really like them. 3 stars is where I personally only thought a book was like okay. Like, I didn't necessarily vibe with it, but I can see why other people do like it, if that makes sense. It's often for like really hyped books that I read and I'm like, I don't know if this is for me. And I don't want to give it like a lower rating because the book is probably good for someone who enjoys it, like enjoys that style of book, but for me it was a bit of a eh. 2-star is just something that's straight up not very good, in my opinion. Like, I just didn't enjoy reading it. I didn't like it. And 1 star is for books that are just like either outright offensive, like maybe they engage in like harmful stereotyping, or they're so badly written that I just couldn't read it. Like, it's just that bad. I will say, I rarely give anything below a 3 stars. Maybe because, in the first place, I only tend to read books that I think I'm gonna like, which, I don't know if that's a good thing. Maybe I should broaden my horizons more, but yeah, tend to mostly 4 stars, probably, with a few 5 stars and a few 3 stars. You'll see, I don't really have that much variety in the type of book I like to read. Maybe it's the autistic love of routine and familiarity coming out, but I tend to mostly read historical fiction, fantasy fiction, historical fantasy fiction, sometimes books based on like myths. Greek mythology is a big one right now. And occasionally I might read like a contemporary novel, like a novel set in the present day, but it's rare. To be honest, I mostly read things that are very different to the present day, and I think that's probably deliberate, some kind of escapism thing going on. All right, I think that's everything. I think we can move on to talking about the journal itself. Let's start with the basics. What notebook am I using? It is a Leuchtturm A5 dot grid in this beautiful like burgundy colour that kind of matches my nails, mostly. I love it when that happens. Anyway, yeah, it's the dot grid, A5. Love these books. Used to use them as my bullet journals back when I did that, and just couldn't resist getting one again for this reading journal. I do like the freedom that a dot grid gives, where, you know, it's easier to stick images in, or visually easier, for me at least, if it's not lined. Like, I feel weird sticking images in lined books, but that might just be a me thing. As for how I use it, there are two types of spreads in here, and I'm actually going to flick to the end to show you the first type. First of all, while I'm reading a book, I take notes on it. I will write kind of like how I'm feeling about it, any observations I want to make that I think I want to remember for when I come to review it. You can see I've started taking notes here for the book I'm reading now, which is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. Loving it so far. I have covered some of it up because spoilers. And I think in general, if I do future flip throughs, I probably won't show the notes pages because they do often contain spoilers. Like, you can't write about what's happening without mentioning what's happening, you know? What I'll do is, every time I pick up the book to read, I start a new little heading with the date. At the end, I'll fill in like how many pages I read, and I'll just write down any observations. I will also note down any quotes that really stood out to me. I used to save this for the very end. Like, I used to mark them in the book and then copy them all out at the end, but I stopped doing that because it kind of felt like a slog to just sit there and often write pages of quotes all at once. I kind of prefer this system of like writing the quotes down as I go. Feels a bit less overwhelming. When I finish the book, I will hopefully have quite a few notes on how I was feeling throughout the process, and I will use those notes to write a review. And for that, I'm going to skip back to the beginning. So we're back with Femina. This is what a typical review spread looks like for me. I'll kind of hand letter the title with my Tombow black brush pen. I will stick in a little printed out image of the book cover, and I actually have a little note at the beginning of the book of like the size of the pictures, because when I did this in like an old commonplace book, I'd always forget how big I actually made the previous pictures, and then they'd all be different sizes, and it annoyed me. Anyway, yeah, I've made a note this time of how big I like the pictures to be. In the corner, I'll write what number book of the year it is. This was the first book I read this year, back in January. And I'll note down certain pieces of data about every book. The author's name, the rating I've given it, the genre, the dates that I read it, and if a book is part of a series, I'll write what the series is. Hang on, if I flip forward, I can show you that too. Where is Akatar? Here it is. So yeah, I would write the name of the series and then like the number in the series. And then the main body is my review, basically. I'll write what I liked, what I didn't like, if relevant. Sometimes there isn't anything I disliked about a book. And yeah, I'll refer back to my notes pages when I'm making this review, because especially if it's taken me a while to read a book, I genuinely need that memory refresher of like what I thought about it at the beginning. Like, did I like it all the way through? Was I a bit meh at the beginning and then it got better? You know, I usually genuinely cannot remember by the time I finish the book, so that's where the notes pages come in handy. Also, you'll see that on some of these older backfilled reviews, let me find an example. Here we go. For some of the older backfilled reviews, I also added quotes that I enjoyed from the book. Obviously, I'm not doing that anymore because I'm now including the quotes in the notes page. So that's kind of a relic of a previous journaling style, and you won't see it in any future spreads. All right, I think that's all the basics about the journaling system, but please let me know if I missed anything, if you have any questions about how I reading journal, any questions about my reading style in general. I love answering questions in the comments, so please leave any you have. But let's get started on the flip through. So, the first book I read this year, as mentioned, was Femina by Yanina Ramirez, who, yes, is the same historian that I mentioned that I met. She's amazing. I love her work. I loved this book in particular because it focuses on the women of the medieval era who have historically, pun kind of intended, been written out of the historical record. A lot of previous historians kind of just cared about the men and didn't really care about the women, didn't care to research them. And also after the Protestant Reformation, a lot of women's writings were destroyed because they decided that a woman's place is in the home, and these heretical women who wrote things, how dare they? They must be erased from the record to stop, other women from thinking they can do things. Anyway, yeah, this was a great book about a number of women and groups of women in the Middle Ages who did remarkable things, and the previous historical accounts might have, if not totally ignored, then at least undervalued and under-respected. It covered a lot of different women who I'd never heard of, some of them, but they did remarkable things. And it really inspired me to keep on reading about the history of women and non-binary people, and basically people who aren't just white men. All right, moving on from Femina, we move to fiction. These are two very different books. We've got Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, first of all, which is, for a classic, quite a short book, which I think is why I picked it. I wanted to just read something short and fairly easy breezy. Unfortunately, I forgot that obviously the Brontes write in a very distinctive Victorian style that is not necessarily what you'd call easy breezy. It's a lot to unpack sometimes, but I still really enjoy their work. Anne also wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is one of my favourite books ever, considered the first feminist novel. I love it. But yeah, Agnes Grey, it was all right. It was a solid book. It's not as exciting and dramatic as some of the other Bronte books. It's not Wuthering Heights, there's not very much pining on the moors in this one. But it was still an interesting look at life at the time, specifically the life of a governess at the time. For anyone not aware, a governess is kind of like a live-in nanny / tutor. It was quite a common role for women in the Victorian era. And I can confidently say that you could not pay me enough money to be a governess. It sounds awful from what is described in Agnes Grey, which was semi-autobiographical. And I feel sorry for Anne Bronte for what she apparently went through as a governess, and sorry for all governesses at the time, to be honest. It does not seem fun. But the book isn't all doom and gloom. There's a little bit of a romance to brighten things up. And it's an interesting social commentary of, themes that are still relevant today in the UK in particular. Things like, classism, big thing over here still, and misogyny, big thing worldwide still. Anyway, yeah, gave that one 4 stars. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, meanwhile, was a 5-star read. It was brilliant. I honestly probably wouldn't have picked this out myself, but I think I read it as part of an online book club or a book group, and I'm so glad I did because it was so good. It's a novel, I'd say, about relationships, primarily platonic, also romantic, set kind of against the backdrop of the video gaming industry, which as a video gamer myself, I was very drawn to when I realised that was what it was about. It was kind of really fascinating to see what it might be like behind the scenes of making a game. This was in the world of the 1990s, 2000s, so not necessarily what it's like to make one today, but still. It was very gripping, had a lot of twists and turns, some of which emotionally destroyed me, particularly towards the end, and I really got very invested in the characters, even though most of them are not actually that likeable. There's some pretty morally ambiguous and slightly annoying characters in this book, but despite that, I was really gripped and wanted to know what happened to them, which is the sign of a well-written book, if you can make me care about an annoying character. Let's see what is up next. Honestly, I read these 2 books one after the other, and it was the best time because they're both incredible. February, March was just so good for reading because I read these incredible books back to back, and amazing. I will say both of them, and in fact, we can probably put Tomorrow ×3 in this category as well, of books that emotionally destroyed me. Hamnet, very, very much in that category. To be honest, it's already obvious from the blurb. It's about when Shakespeare's son Hamnet got plague. So not exactly the cheeriest of topics, but it's an incredible book. It is so beautifully written. It's told through the kind of viewpoint of Shakespeare's wife. I love that Shakespeare is basically a minor character, which is nice. It's actually, we're gonna tell this through the viewpoint of the women involved. And yeah, I'm here for that. But yes, it was also extremely sad, an extremely accurate picture of grief. Also very, very good historical fiction. Just the level of detail, it's incredible. You really feel you're in Tudor England. It's so immersive. It's just so brilliant. And yeah, just bring a box of tissues, maybe multiple. As for Circe, also beautifully written, but that is a given with Madeline Miller. Obviously, from the title, you can gather it's about Circe, who is a prominent figure in Greek mythology, although I somehow had missed her entire existence despite studying Greek mythology. Don't know how I managed that one, because she really does pop up in a lot of different major myths, in quite a major way sometimes in a minor way. But that makes this book amazing because it's basically just chronologically telling her life story, and she crops up in so many exciting events that the book turns out to be very exciting. Because yeah, there's so much intrigue, so much adventure, a lot of like death and grief and misery, because it's Greek mythology, what do you expect? They love their death, grief and misery. But yeah, beautifully written, again, very, very gripping, very, female focused, lots of strong women. Another one that will probably make you feel things, but hopefully that's a good thing. Honestly, if I could pick like one of the recent books about women in Greek mythology, because there have been a lot, let's be real, it's having a moment right now, this is the one I would recommend. It's just so good. Okay, we're going to move on to another book that emotionally destroyed me. There's a theme here. I like my books upsetting yet excellent. I don't know what that says about me. Sorrow and Bliss. What a book. It's another of the rare contemporary fiction books that made it in here. And oh boy, it is a depiction of one woman's mental illness, essentially. And obviously that does mean there are some very upsetting moments, a lot of, well, sorrow, as per the title. But there's also bliss interspersed in there. The book is very, very witty. It made me laugh out loud multiple times, and I'm not really a laugh out loud person, so that tells you all you need to know. And it's very, very accurate in the sense that it depicts the real highs and lows that often come with any kind of mental illness. And it depicts the messiness that comes with mental illness. It's not sanitized, which I liked. It's another book, kind of like Tomorrow Times 3, where a lot of the characters just aren't very likable, and yet you still find yourself so gripped by their stories. You want to know what happens to them. For the most part, you want things to turn out all right for them, with some exceptions, as you can probably read there. I loved it. I took 10 days to read it, not because I was reading it slowly, but because I read almost all of it in like 2 days and then got sad that it was going to end. So I really like dragged out the last few chapters because I didn't want it to end. Continuing on. Ooh, it's a duology. This is the Wilderwood duology, For the Wolf and For the Throne. They're kind of historical fantasy set in like a fictional land and lots of like fairy tale folklore elements. Despite the cover, this is not based on Red Riding Hood. It's based on Beauty and the Beast, which I wasn't expecting because, the cover, very Red Riding Hood. It's literally called For the Wolf. Yeah, I really did enjoy this. It was kind of the first fantasy book that I'd read in a long time, and it really like reignited my love for the genre. It was so immersive. I keep using that word, but it's true. I get so immersed in these books. It had a great magic system, wonderful world building, like there was political stuff going on, there's magic, specifically forest magic, there's like magical trees. There's just a lot to love here. It's also a romance, should mention. Both of these are romances, and in both books, actually, the heroes are like brooding, slightly miserable, tall emo boys, and I'm here for that. I am here for that. Give me more of that. I very much enjoyed that element of it. And yeah, if you're kind of in for an easy read, like these weren't challenging, they're no Agnes Grey, put it that way. They were just a fun read. A few little like plot holes and bits of the lore that didn't quite make sense here and there, but honestly I didn't even mind that much because I was having a lot of fun. I was enjoying myself, and I was just basically screaming at each book like, just get together already, for like 300 pages. So it was a great time. We'll probably reread these at some point, although I'm going to lend them to my friend Courtney first. Shout out to Courtney if you're watching. So yeah, both of them got a 4.5, and I have the author's next book. I think it's called like The Foxglove King. Anyway, they've just started a new series and I'm looking forward to reading it. Moving on, we have a couple more kind of like fantasy books. So The Girl in the Tower is actually the second in a trilogy. I read the first book last year. It's kind of like historical fantasy set in like medieval Russia with folklore elements woven in. I gave the first book in the series 5 stars because I thought it was just beautiful, like beautifully written. Again, like it's so poetic, but without being like off-puttingly poetic. You know when people throw in a big word and you're like, you're just doing that to seem smart. Like that wasn't the sense I got in The Bear and the Nightingale, which is the first book. The lead character, Vazia, I adore. She's everything. She is magical. She is strong-willed. She fights against the patriarchal restraints that they try to put on her. She's just brilliant. The second book was also good. I knocked off half a star because some of the like magical lore kind of felt a bit confusing at the end. And, you know, I know magic isn't exactly like rational because it's magic, but there were some things where I was like, I don't know why that's happening in the way it is, you know, like I'm a bit confused, but, you know, that was a really minor thing. The rest of the book, incredible. It's very hard for me to say much more about it without spoiling the first book in the series, so I'm going to leave it there and just believe me when I say that these are beautifully written fantasy, historical, folklore books. I'm currently reading The Winter of the Witch, which is the final book in the trilogy, and it's broken my reading slump. I'm so into it. I love it. It's great. Moving on to a book that, if you're on like Bookstagram or BookTok, you will have heard of this. It was everywhere earlier in the year, Legends and Lattes. It's a very cozy fantasy about an orc who decides to quit bounty hunting and open a coffee shop. Except nobody in her fantasy land has really heard of coffee. So there's some barriers to overcome there. And, you know, it's fairly gentle. There are some obstacles to overcome. There are some slightly dramatic moments, but it's not the most eventful book ever. If you're looking for something that's truly like rip-roaring adventure, you're not going to get it here. But if you're in for just like a cozy feel-good book that has LGBTQ romance in it, that has lots of different magical creatures in it, that has descriptions of cinnamon rolls, which honestly, cinnamon rolls, so good. Anyway, yeah, if you were into any of those things, you will love this book. And I'm really excited for the prequel, which might have already come out or is about to come out. I'm sure it was a November release date. But yeah, totally gonna get that for Christmas and read it because this was so fun, just so wholesome, and it made me very happy and it gave me the warm fuzzies. All right, we're getting through them. Let's move on to, right, 2 incredible books. Let's start with Cecily, obviously, because it's first. Yeah. Cecily is a historical fiction book about Cecily. Surprise, surprise. Specifically, Cecily of York, who was the mother of 2 English kings in the medieval period, kind of like the real end of the medieval period. And they were Edward IV, who you might have heard of, and Richard III, who you may well have heard of because he's known for allegedly like bumping off his nephews. Whether he did or not, disputed. Anyway, Cecily was their mother. She was also the wife of Richard of York, who tried to become king. And the Wars of the Roses, if you've heard of them, were, you know, a battle between the Yorkists, Cecily and her family, and the Lancastrians. And it was a very devastating war. Like a whole generation of the nobility was just like gone because of that war. And it was also a war in which women played a very prominent role behind the scenes. And sometimes not even behind the scenes, sometimes just in the scenes. And Cecily was one of those major players. And I wrote my master's thesis on 2 women of the Wars of the Roses. Not Cecily, unfortunately, but 2 other women. And that meant that as soon as I heard this was coming out, I was like, gotta get it. It's right up my alley. And it was, as it turns out. It was amazing. One of my favourite historical fiction books ever. And I've read a lot of them. But this one came out on top for me. Loved it so much. It covers a lot of action. Again, like, it was a very dramatic period of history. There's a lot to cover. It's also great to see another book where a strong-willed, dare I say, unlikable woman is forefront. Cecily makes some pretty questionable choices, some morally, not even grey, just morally bad choices. The magic of the book is you still root for her because of how she's written. While on one side she is questionable, on the other side she is deeply passionate, she is inspirational, she is so dedicated to breaking down all the barriers that her society tried to put in her way. She's just brilliant. This, incredibly enough, was the author's debut novel, and it's apparently the start of a series. So looking forward to the next book, which is apparently coming out in July next year, so gonna look out for that. Moving on to the second book on this spread, Tales of Thread, which is a short story collection with some poems interspersed in there, all themed around Greek mythology. I got this as an advanced reader copy, and I really loved it. Again, a lot of Greek mythology books out there right now, but this one I thought was really innovative. Like, every myth had a twist that made it fresh, and the twists were twists still, while also not being so out there that it felt not in keeping with the mythology, if that makes sense. Like, it was the right balance of intriguing and different without being like just so out there that you're like, what even is this? Like, why is this happening? And besides anything else, the writing is just beautiful. It's so emotionally resonant. Like, there were some moments that really packed the old emotional punch. And that was especially impressive to me because it is obviously short stories. There's less time to set up that emotional payoff, but the author managed it, and I really enjoyed it. All right, on to, I believe, the last spread, which are two books that I'm sure many people will recognise. It's A Court of Thorns and Roses and A Court of Mist and Fury. And these books have been popular for a very long time, but for some reason I'd really resisted reading them. I think it's because I'm always suspicious of things that are very hyped. Like, I'm always like, how can this possibly live up to the hype, you know? So I don't read it because I don't want to be let down. But this year I decided to finally take the plunge and read the series, and I'm so glad I did. Because, look, these books, especially the first one, are not literary masterpieces. Sometimes the writing is a bit clunky and you're like, ooh, that reads oddly. Sometimes the characters feel a bit flat or feel a bit annoying. Lots of characters I could name there, but I'm not going to because spoilers. But I don't care, because I had a great time reading these. Like, they're so silly at times, especially the first one. As I say, the first one I gave 3.5 stars because, like, it was okay. You know? It was all right. I enjoyed it. Some bits were a bit meh. It went on a bit long at points, but it was all right. The second one, however, much better. The first one is worth it just to get to the second one. Especially in the second one, the characters are incredible. I loved the new characters introduced in the second book. Also, the setting in the second book, Valaris, I want to live there, let me tell you, sounds incredible. They're also very romance heavy, a bit spicy. Yeah, just a lot to love, really, and it was a lesson to me not to let hype put you off a series, because sometimes you'll have just a really fun time reading them, even if they're not the best written books ever. I do have the rest of the books on my shelf, but I decided to give it a break after reading the second one because I think I'd been reading nothing but this series for like 2 months. Felt like a bit of a break. Okay, maybe a month and a half looking at the dates. Anyway, still felt like a bit of a break. But then that was the start of my reading slump, so maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have just continued reading the series and my slump never would have happened. Anyway, yeah, I'm Team Reese. I love these books. I can't wait to continue reading them, and I will probably read every other series this author has written, because I'm kind of addicted now. Anyway, that brings us to the end. There are a few more pages in here, but I'm not going to show them because they're either me starting a book and then being like, I don't like this very much, I'm bored, or they're spoilery notes about the book I'm currently reading, so don't want to show either of those things. I hope you all have a great week. Next week, I think I might do some kind of like real-time plan with me in my Hobonichi Cousin, just to show you what it's like for me to put together a spread. I'm also thinking of pre-recording the week after's video because I'm going to be away that weekend, like not next weekend, the weekend after that. But I want to do a video because I love doing videos. So anyway, I'm thinking I'll pre-record a Q&A. So look out for a post on like the community tab and also on my Instagram if you follow me there, asking for questions for a Q&A. I'll do that sometime in the next week or so probably. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, consider giving me a subscribe. Would much appreciate it. In the comments, let me know what your favourite books of the year so far have been. I'm always looking for recommendations of new things to read. And yeah, see you all in the next video.